Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. The first item that worth showing to you here is actually scan probes on port 11211 TCP again. This is that memcached application basically for caching web servers. Works on that port and apparently has some means to get in, perhaps to capture what's been cached. So subtly different than the shell shock situation. Or actually, no, it was the heartbleed situation. Subtly different. You wouldn't be able to get net to private keys most likely in that case. And then the a sort of a partner port on this one, port 6379, which is associated with the Redis application, which is basically a streaming application, again associated with web server applications. This scanning, as well as actually I'm showing scanning activity here on port 32764 as well, all associated with a single source in China that's been scanning across a number of ports. We've been reporting on this: 5800, 5900, 6379, 7001, 8009, 8090, 8088, 11211, and then 32764. By the way, 32764 is associated with a backdoor into some home router activity. So very much indicative of malicious intent here that is defined backdoors or avenues into data or systems that you probably hadn't intended to be there. Next item here is scam probes on 1720 UDP. This is associated with H323. It's used for basically media over the internet, so it could be associated with a voice over IP call control, which is also oftentimes managed through actually port 5060, which is SIP. And in this particular case, it's primarily from a single source in Germany, which also happens to be scanning on port 22443 and 5060. Again, a clear indicator they're probably looking for SIP gateways or VoIP gateways. Traditionally, this had been popular. Stan, you had done some investigation and looking for gateways that could be potentially used for fraud or toll bypass or toll fraud. Right.
I think I guess a few years ago, a lot of scanning on 56, SIP vicious scanning. It was just a lot of it there. And yes, they were looking for all kinds of toll fraud I guess servers that were open that they could use for toll fraud activity and things like that.
Yeah, now clearly, just looking at the graph here, we haven't seen a large quantity of this lately. It's been relatively low, but we did see a relatively large spike just today in this activity. We're only looking at, actually, I think this actually shows 60 days of activity here, but it does give a relatively good perspective of what's been going on, which is not terrible, but some really recent activity associated with this. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, last week the top port was port 22 TCP. This week we're seeing port 23 TCP at the top. So we're going to take a little closer look at that one, followed by port 135 TCP, port 22, that's SSH, 9064, which is a proxy port, 445 TCP. We looked at sort of a long-term history, I guess over the last year or so on port 445. That activity is going down as Conficker is finally kind of withering away. Port 53 UDP, looking for those DNS servers, potentially open DNS resolvers. 1433, Microsoft SQL Database. 3389, Remote Desktop Protocol. Port 1900 UDP, again, that could be used for reflection attacks, so likely probing, looking for those simple service discovery protocol servers. And then last but not least here, 8080 TCP, which is generally associated with proxy service.
That other bucket seems to be getting bigger every week. Is that me, or?
Oh, the other bucket? Well, that's a good sign, actually. It's suggestive of other things sort of being more predominant, and so, spreading out, possibly. I guess it depends on how you look at good things. No, it's a good point. Perhaps what I should do in the future is try to include, how many other ports are involved. That is another statistic that we track. It could suggest more diversity in the ports that are being scanned, and so less of them actually make it into.
So there'll be 65,526 other ports in that?
It'll be actually, it's more like 128,000.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, because
so did you say TCP 23? Isn't that sort of like leaving the front door open? I mean, it's sort of inviting trouble.
Well, actually, it's funny you should mention that, Chet, because there are an awful lot of Internet of Thing things out there, IoT, what I refer to as the unmanaged devices or poorly created devices, ones that really should never attach to the internet, but they're designed or sold for that purpose, that do leave port 23 open. Sometimes they even have an undocumented default password that that end users don't realize they need to change, and consequently, there are botnets out there that are basically scanning the internet, gathering these, and then using them for denial of service attacks. So a lot of even the stressor services or booter services, denial of service attack that's been capabilities that are commercialized are going out and exploiting these devices and using them for that purpose. At least in somebody that's buying Solaris, I would hope is savvy enough to lock it down, put it in behind a firewall and protect it reasonably well. A lot of these other devices, they're being bought by residential users. They don't know what a port is, let alone what to do to protect it. And a lot of these devices they're firmware. They don't even really have a means for the end user to correct it, short of knowing that they can log in on Telnet and then go in and then perhaps change some parameters, which will reset once they reboot the device anyway. So.
Yeah, I guess if you're seeing all these port probes for Telnet, and likely you think it's related to sort of Internet of Things type things, whether that's smart fridges and TVs and thermostats and things, it almost suggests we kind of need to evolve our thoughts around our home gateway routers, in that designing them in a way with some sort of a DMZ for your Internet of Things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unfortunately, some of these things are, in fact, the home routers. So.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've written about that only too many times.
Yeah. So, but you're absolutely right, and we've got some things going on where we're looking to try to perhaps inspire or motivate some improvements in the ecosystem around IoT devices, and particularly ones that don't fit into the category of what I refer to as managed, and try to get perhaps some safety standards around it. So hopefully some more news on that in the future. But take a little closer look at the activity that we're seeing here. We're showing 180 days of activity. It's interesting to see the top graph, which is actually showing the number of probes, and the bottom graph that's showing the number of sources doing those probes. Prior to, say, 30 days ago, you can see, further to the left, where there's a really pretty close correlation between the number of sources that are doing the scanning and the number of probes we're seeing on the network. That was very clearly worm-related activity. More devices scanning, more probes. More recently, what we're seeing is a lot of probes, not so many more devices introduced. So that, to me, suggests the possibility of a couple things. One, perhaps that the scanning activity is in preparation to build a botnet. So we may have another player that's trying to get involved. Or it could be some other sort of motivation. But in any case, they haven't really created that worm capability or the the ability to use many devices in that scanning activity in this particular instance. So it does look like it's a little bit of a different profile than we've seen before. We'll have to see how that evolves going on. But in any case, in terms of the number of sources that have been probing, down relatively speaking. But as we look on the next graph here, the pie chart, port 23 TCP still has the most sources doing the probing activity by far, well in excess of port 445 TCP that we had seen as the predominant leader in the past. And then actually, there really aren't too many others on this particular pie chart. They're really worth mentioning. Just port 1900 UDP, usually that's associated with reflective denial of service attacks themselves, and then port 80 TCP is showing up on there in terms of, and that's not unusual to see a lot of sources probing for port 80.
Speaking of reflected denial of service attacks, there was an article by, I think Akamai put out a report that there's a Microsoft SQL related port 1434.
1434, yes.
Is being used now for UDP reflection. I'm not surprised we didn't see it this week, but I have a feeling that we're probably going to see it in the coming weeks now that it's been getting more press. That's
certainly a possibility. We have been tracking it. It is included in our repertoire of things that we're tracking at this point. And in terms of the size of attacks or even the number of attacks, it's really way down in the noise still. So we have seen, since you brought it up, some more sizable attacks using SNMP compared to previously, but still far and above some of the other parts. The DNS, the character generator, and the NTP are way above in terms of their contributions to these reflective denial of service attacks still today.
Good to know.
So, but it still could develop. I think a lot of folks took their Microsoft SQL databases off the internet when the SQL Slammer worm just completely obliterated a number of systems. Hopefully, the people that are really running those, assuming they're 14 years later, they're still relatively the same people.
Well, that's 14 years of brand new admins who haven't learned that lesson yet, though.
Yeah, it's a good possibility. So we'll have to see how many are really out there and see if that really develops. So good topic to bring up. Thanks, Matt.